The Pentagon, we're not getting rid of the Pentagon, even though they haven't been able to pass an audit 8 years in a row. There's over $2.5 trillion, let me say that again, over $2.5 trillion missing in the Pentagon. Like real money.
$2.5 trillion missing from the Pentagon. 8 years in a row, they can't pass a basic audit. And nobody, not DOJ, not Congress, not the people who just shut down an entire foreign aid agency, nobody is talking about getting rid of the Pentagon. But you said, gone. That's what a congressman just said out loud, on the record in a congressional hearing. And the witness sitting across from him couldn't disagree. This exchange is only 6 minutes long. But it might be the most devastating 6 minutes of the entire USAID debate. Because what Congressman Jared Moskowitz did in this hearing wasn't just political theater. He built a logical trap, step by step, and then he walked the witness right into it. Here's how it happened.
I appreciate that, and I agree. I want to go with this logic for a second that because there was waste, fraud, and abuse in USAID, we should get rid of it, right? Which, that was the argument. I assume you would agree that in a $7 trillion budget, we could probably find, in fact, we have found waste, fraud, and abuse in every department, right?
That's why you have inspectors general to root it out.
That's right. So there's waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon, right?
Correct.
And there's waste, fraud, and abuse in DHS.
Yes.
In fact, we just saw the other day, $200 million, right, to be spent on advertising, right? That sounds like a waste to me. I mean, it was more money that was spent on the last Jurassic Park movie or one of the Lord of the Rings movies or one of the Harry Potter movies. I think the Barbie movie was less expensive. In fact, I think every movie except one that was nominated for an Oscar was less expensive than what Kristi Noem spent. To spend $200 million, Kristi Noem, and not get nominated by an Oscar, I think shows their liberal bias. So there's definitely waste, right? But no one's talking about getting rid of those places. No one's talking about, just because we're spending, $9 million on crab legs in the Pentagon or $220 million on furniture in the Pentagon or, $100,000 on a Steinway piano in the Pentagon. No one's talking about getting rid of the Pentagon just because there's waste, fraud, and abuse, right? That would be unreasonable, Mr. Kaplan. You agree?
No one's talking about getting rid of those agencies.
Right, of course, right? So it would be, and that's where the disconnect is here, is that somehow because this agency, no different than all the other agencies, we could sit, HUD, Department of Agriculture, we could go through them, right? There's waste, fraud, and abuse, and we owe it to the American people, by the way, to eliminate that waste, fraud, and abuse. There's no excuse for that, okay? We owe it to them. But in the search of trying to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse doesn't mean we should get rid of an entire agency. No, we should eliminate the waste, fraud, and abuse from those agencies, because all of these agencies still have important functions. Obviously, the Pentagon, we're not getting rid of the Pentagon, even though they haven't been able to pass an audit 8 years in a row. There's over $2.5 trillion, let me say that again, over $2.5 trillion missing in the Pentagon, like real money, okay? And no one's talking about getting rid of it. And so, that's the function of the problem I have. Look, in my own household budget, right? I can tell you my kids are definitely, there's tons of waste in my family budget based on what my kids like to spend, okay? There's definitely abuse going on. And based on the amount of boxes that show up at my house every day, my wife is definitely committing fraud, okay? But the point is, I'm not getting rid of these people, right? What am I gonna do? I'm gonna sit them down at the kitchen table and I'm gonna say, we need to spend less, right? What are we spending on? We didn't have that conversation here with USAID. We never got to say, hey, look, these programs, delete them. These things, get rid of them, okay? Every other agency somehow is getting that benefit of the doubt, right? We're giving that benefit of the doubt to the Pentagon. I want to end with this. Now that these functions are going to move over to the State Department, all right, Mr. Kaplan, do you think the State Department has the resources, the personnel to do all of this oversight?
Let's stop right there. We never got to have that conversation with USAID. That is the core of what just happened in that room. Every other agency in the federal government, when waste is found, gets a process. They get called in. They get questioned. They get given a chance to cut the fat, defend the function, and restructure. USAID didn't get that. It got eliminated. And the witness, the accountability expert brought in to testify about oversight, couldn't argue with the logic, because there is no argument. $9 million on crab legs, the Pentagon, still standing. $220 million on furniture, the Pentagon, still standing. $100,000 on a Steinway piano, the Pentagon, still standing. $2.5 trillion unaccounted for, 8 consecutive failed audits, the Pentagon, still standing. USAID, an agency with inspectors general, with oversight mechanisms, with documented reform pathways, gone. And then Moskowitz asked the question that nobody in this debate wants to answer. Now that USAID's functions are being transferred to the State Department, does the State Department have the resources, the personnel, and the oversight capacity to do this properly? The witness's answer was telling. He warned that the same predators who stole from USAID will try to steal from state. He said maximum oversight is essential. He said you need adequate staffing and an effective IG. In other words, you need exactly what USAID had, which you just dismantled. 1. The argument for eliminating USAID, waste, fraud, and abuse applies equally to every single federal agency. The witness agreed. 2. No other agency has been eliminated for this reason, including the Pentagon, which has $2.5 trillion unaccounted for and has failed every audit for 8 years running. 3. USAID never got the process every other agency gets, the kitchen table conversation, the line-by-line review, the chance to cut and reform before the whole thing gets shut down. 4. The witness himself admitted that the same problems will follow the money to the State Department, and that maximum oversight, adequate staffing, and a strong IG are essential, which is what they just eliminated. If the standard is waste means shutdown, then the Pentagon should have been gone a decade ago. If the standard is we reform, we cut, we fix, then USAID should still be here. One standard was applied to one agency. That's not accountability. That's a choice. If this hearing gave you something to think about, share it. Hit like if you think the same standard should apply to every agency. Subscribe if you want the next hearing breakdown the moment it drops. And drop in the comments, should the Pentagon face the same standard that was applied to USAID? I'll see you in the next one.